Hello all, a very warm welcome. I'm just going to put out hopefully a pretty small video today, again building on some of what we've already covered, just regarding the blatantly kind of fictitious nature of the gospel stories. We're going to focus on miracles now and just build, I hope, a fairly broad circumstantial basis for properly designating the gospel stories as fiction, so that we can then build on the stories truly for what they are, and that is timeless and eternal, powerful moral teachings, and also anagogical, high spiritual messages as well, from perhaps channeled information, channeled from something. Who can tell? We're going to find this out on this journey we're taking together. So, as far as miracles go, I'm just going to read again from my book, and also just give a couple of quotes towards the end of this, and just expound on them for a little while. It shouldn't be long. Anyway, if we take the miracles Jesus is said to have performed as a good indication of certain of his deeds not actually being items of his recorded history but fiction, as they are rife with contradiction, then what can we tell from this? The English here needs to be refined a bit, I think. We would suppose that a miracle worker becoming well known for actually performing real on-the-spot miracles would garner the attention of many people, with at least a few capable of writing these events down. We would then assume these accounts would find themselves to larger audiences, or at least find their way to someone who could courier missionaries, speakers of the great news of this great sorry about this. Spread the great news, or being close to someone with enough political or social clout to garner the attention of peoples who would be able to convey them to others in some kind of office, so that the public record would give us something to look on even 2,000 years later. Taking the miraculous and therefore attention-grabbing, we would assume, nature of miracles, we would find they run something like this, depending on how we interpret them and count them. So, sorry if that was a bit grammatically weird. We find, in the Gospels, 36 in the four gospel accounts, distinct though often repeated through the different accounts, and this is not a small number, and yet we have only the four gospels that list them as Paul, and none of the other epistle writers mention them at all. Writers we will mention later never offer any. We find that Mark lists 19, Matthew 22, Luke names 21, and John only 8. John is the last written gospel according to mainstream historians. So firstly, where have the others gone in this latest account? We shall note that of the miracles, there were 3 raisings of the dead, 24 healing miracles, and 9 miraculous events. What's more, according to David Scribner in his book The Jesus Hoax, and this isn't a great book, I must say, but he does list these quite helpfully for us. Mark recounts 13 miracles, healings, which include exorcisms. Matthew repeats 11 of these and then adds 4 new ones. Luke covers 12 of the Mark-Matthew miracles and then adds another 4 of his own. John inexplicably ignores all the previous healings, miracles, and then describes 3 brand new ones. It's a similar story with the nature miracles. Mark has 5, Matthew repeats these and then adds 1 of his own. Luke covers 2 of the previous ones, then adds a new one. John includes 2 old miracles and then adds 2 new. Mark actually covers the least number of miracles, and every one of Mark's miracles is repeated in the other 2 synoptics. But then you've got John coming along, completely eliminating the vast majority of the miracles, and then adding new unique ones. And John is, of course, the beloved disciple, someone who's closest to Jesus. What's going on? Why this huge discrepancy in miracles? It's just strange if you're talking about people who knew each other well, or in Mark and Luke, who knew the disciples well. These guys are just not recounting the same events. They're making up new ones. They're fabricating new. They're excluding some of the previous. It's just a mess, really. Why are there new miracles being laid on older ones? It's not particularly what we'd find. I asked ChatGPT this yesterday, and I asked him it to give me a pretty comprehensive breakdown. It's well worth doing, so you can see exactly how the nature of these accounts really cannot comport with an historical account, because they are so asymmetrical. I'm going to go on just very quickly. And this is Bart Ehrman. Now I'm going to do again in a future video, a breakdown of some of the things he's actually gotten wrong. It was a brilliant book length PhD thesis by a guy called what was his name? Raphael Latasta. I think you can find it online, but he breaks down some of the big problems in one or two of, I think one specifically of Art Ehrman's work, Did Jesus Exist? And it's well worth checking out. Ehrman's a great scholar. He's written some phenomenal books on Christianity. His work on forgeries is excellent. I have that book specifically, Forged, but he has made some big boo-boos in his time, and specifically taken as factual, completely speculative works, and then try to work from these speculative works truly, and then build a history on those things, and talked about the Q sources and stuff, and forced to fit a narrative which is based upon conjecture, essentially. So couple of things then, couple of quotes at the end. But remember, these miracles come from a mythic perspective anyway. They're very largely going to be, fictions, not true. Most people, I think, would understand this. Even Christians will acknowledge that there are things in the Bible that aren't historically true. And yes, what we're trying to do is essentially separate out the mythology from what might be somebody who had followers, as I've said before, who might have been crucified by the Sanhedrin and the Romans. And that's basically it. Jesus has existed in the first century that had these qualities. And in BC times, HaNotzri, Jesus Yeshu HaNotzri, the Nazarene. Nothing to do with the gospel stories, though, as we're going to make aware to people, I hope, in coming months. Okay, this is Bart Ehrman in Forged. Most of the apostles were illiterate and could not, in fact, write. They could not have left an authoritative writing if their souls depended on it. Another problem is that writings started to appear that claimed to be written by apostles, but that contained all sorts of bizarre and contradictory views. Gospels were in circulation that claimed to be written by Jesus' disciples Peter, Philip, and Mary, and his brothers Thomas and James. These letters appeared that were allegedly written by Paul, Peter, and James. Apocalyptic writings describing the end of the world or the fate of souls in the afterlife appeared in the names of Jesus' followers, John, Peter, and Paul. Some writings emerged that claimed to be written by Jesus himself. In many instances, the authors of these writings could not actually have been who they claimed to be, as even the early Christians realized. So that's Bart Ehrman, Forged, Writing in the Name of God, Why the Bible's Authors Are Not Who We Think They Are. That's page 8. And again, from the same book, Matthew probably did not write Matthew, for example, or John in short. There were long, protracted, and even heated debates in the early church over forged documents. Early Christians realized that there were numerous forgeries in circulation, and they wanted to know which books were written by the alleged authors and which were not. Again, that's the same book, page 10. And there we go. I mean, what is now becoming more and more clear is that how much of that literature was written in the 2nd century doesn't have any kind of grounding in the first that we know of at all. Matthew as well was written in Greek and carries so many of these stylistic features of a Greek authorship, with Greek grammar and Greek tropes and literary kind of stylistics that weren't really in Hebrew, that are not carried in Hebrew. Hebrew and Greek are from two different language kind of bases, so to speak, and the one, Hebrew, does not transfer easily into the other. That's why we know now that is the case, and I will be showing some of this work again in the future. I've got to try and make a mental note of all of this stuff because I've written it all down. So we have Papias saying in his, let me see if I can reel this off my memory. Papias says that Matthew wrote down his oracles in the way that he did, and that people interpreted them as they could. That this is coming from Eusebius in the 320s, and he had access to Papias's works. But Papias, he wrote a 5-volume account of stories essentially he'd heard from people who claimed to be disciples of Jesus, or to know the disciples. Eusebius is quite clear of that, but he quotes Papias only a few times, and he didn't think Papias was very smart, and he says as much. And he says that he didn't really understand what he was looking at and who he was talking to necessarily. Papias Eusebius via Papias via Eusebius uses the word oracles. Now that's not, and he even says Matthew wrote down things that were more mystical than the kind of real historical accounts, and that people interpreted Matthew's oracles the way they could. Now that again is a dead giveaway that we're looking at non-historical accounts, and this mystical aspect just comports very well with a more Gnostic view of what he was running into and coming into, which is what my thesis is here, that the earliest Christians were completely mystical. They had revelations of Jesus. That's what they were having, and this is what I think we're looking at with these earliest accounts. Papias comes along in the 1st century, the early first, maybe it could be as late as about 150, we're not sure. And again, this really does push things later. And there's a connection there with John, I think, as well. I'm not too sure. Well, again, we will go into this. But yeah, it's a long story short, the miracles, as well as parables and so on, and specific stories that only appear in John and that never appear in the synoptics, really tell us that we're talking about slightly different traditions that evolved slightly separately, especially John from the synoptics. Matthew was most likely wrote as a reaction or a response to Luke. I think it's fair to say that Luke really represents an older gospel, especially Marcion's copy, which appears to be probably the first. Maybe there is a Mark written alongside Luke. Maybe there's a kind of proto-Mark there. But Mark and Marcion's gospels do share a lot of material. Matthew just copies from Mark, often verbatim. Anyway, peace and love. See you soon. I'm putting out a video every day. I hope to really up the quality of these videos as I go forward, but I'm fairly confident of the research I'm doing here, and I'm really trying to remain completely conversant with the scholarly literature and primary sources. Peace out. Have a good day, and yeah, I'll see you tomorrow.